Well, Chris and Stacey, welcome to Job with Juli. You two, this is the first time you've ever met each other, but you have a very common ministry and area of interest in helping Christians and churches navigate domestic violence. So I'd love to hear from each of you, like how that journey started and why you're so passionate about this topic. Maybe Stacey, you want to go first?
Unlike a lot of people who lead organizations like ours, I am not a survivor of domestic abuse. I was raised in a Christian home. My father was a pastor. And over the course of time, it's a really long, crazy story I don't have time to go into. But basically, God called me into ministry outside of my family. And after seeking him for a couple of years, this was the door he opened, which was a total shock to me. I would never have thought of it or chosen it. I would have thought God would have had me do something that I knew something about. But I really have a heart to be obedient to what God calls me to do. And that is really my motivation. And now I've been doing it for almost 27 years. So,
Well, that's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for saying yes. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, I was not a survivor either, which to Stacey's point, that really is kind of a unicorn in this work. But I was drawn in as a helper and as a pastor. I actually needed some part-time work. I was already teaching at a local criminal corrections facility doing life skills, and I was working with addicts at the time. And an opportunity came available to work in what's called a batterer intervention program. That's to work with abusive men. And after multiple attempts to get me to be the facilitator, I kept saying no. And then they told me how much they'd pay me. And I said, I think the Lord's calling me. It was totally greed. But you know what, Juli and Stacey, what happened was God used that, especially that first year in the work, to really captivate my heart when it came to the needs of this marginalized community, especially from the position of the church. And I tell folks all the time, after literally 10,000 hours or more of case hours of working with abusive men, I believe I'm a better pastor, a better husband, a better father, a better neighbor because of the work that God's done in me, confronting violence in the home and allowing me to use biblical truth to do that.
And I love the combination of you two. Stacey, a lot of your work has been with survivors. And Chris, you've done a lot of work with the guys who are abusive or have been abusive. And
we do that too. Actually, we've done it for over 20 years.
So really?
Wow. I work with the men as well. So I've been facilitating men's groups since 2001 and women's intervention groups just a couple years after that. So we do it all.
Awesome.
We could do a whole podcast on the difference between men's intervention groups and women's intervention groups.
Yeah, we could.
A totally under-researched area, but it is night and day different. A very interesting procedure to work with women and then to turn around and work with men.
Yeah, and I'm passionate about the intervention work as much as I am the recovery work. I feel like the recovery work is important, but we're not really solving the problem if we aren't addressing the abuse, the people who are using abusive behaviors and teaching them how to love like Jesus loves.
Right. Yeah.
That's well said. We often say at Peaceworks that the greatest means of reducing violence against women is addressing the hearts of men. And that's both men who perpetrate these acts, but then also the majority of men. I think it's 20 to 25% of men population-wise are expected to participate in these acts. That means 75 to 80% of us are not. And that's another group of men that needs to be aware of this problem because, and Stacey was alluding to this, I think, this is a men's issue in many ways. Men's violence against women is at epidemic proportions. And it's really going to take addressing the hearts of men, we believe, to curb violence against women.
Chris, you use the term epidemic, which means it's everywhere. And I speak on the topic of sexuality and have become so much more aware over the last 12 or 15 years of the level of sexual brokenness in churches that goes unspoken about. This topic, though, domestic violence, I feel like no one thinks this is happening in their churches. That it's just like we're shocked if we ever hear that there's been domestic violence in a friend, a family member, a church member. How pervasive is it? And why are we so unaware that it's happening?
Well, having been in pastoral ministry for 25 years and have been doing this work for nearly 20 years, I think it would be extremely naive if any of us, especially in the church, were to say it's not happening here. The reality is it is happening there, that it's estimated that between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women are suffering at the hands of an intimate partner. We know, I mean, all of us know that those are historically underreported instances. And so there is a sense in which at any given time, there is a group of women in particular in your congregation that are being abused, have been abused, or someday will be abused. And I think it's imperative that we in the church recognize that, see that as one of those vulnerable communities that Christ has called us to reach, and then apply the gospel to that by being, proactive publicly, but then also, offering training and education, and then finding ways to intervene. Like Stacey was talking about, I think the church has a robust amount of resources to provide both support and care for victims, but also biblical and ministerial confrontation and even correction for perpetrators. So, yeah, I use the word epidemic because I do not think you can go about your everyday life without having a relationship of some sort with a victim of intimate partner violence, whether you are aware of the violence or not. It's that pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. Studies show that the faith community is actually the number one place people go for help, but historically, the faith community has been the least helpful. And I don't think it's because people don't care. I think it's because they aren't educated. They don't understand this issue. And then there's also the piece of their own belief systems that sometimes get in the way of their willingness to take a look at this issue, their fears over divorce or whatever. And I completely get that, having grown up in the church. I completely understand that process. And we do a lot of church staff trainings, and I've had pastors say things like, I don't want to deal with this because it's don't want to open that can of worms, but the can is there. And what would Jesus do if he were here in this moment, and how would he address it? I completely agree with Krista's epidemic that it's one of those issues the church isn't addressing. It's very messy. The church is much more comfortable with addressing issues that are not seen as being in the church, but more outside, like trafficking, which is a horrible, horrible issue that needs to be dealt with. But when they talk about domestic abuse, we're talking about people in our churches.
Yeah.
And you talked about, oftentimes about the sexual abuse stuff that goes on. That is happening in our churches. And we have many men in our programs who have shared they've raped their wife.
Right.
And the other types of things that have gone on. So it is a huge issue and it needs to be addressed. And I see some pastors being a little more willing, but the reality is they are not getting training in seminary. Right. Social workers are not getting trained. Licensed counselors are not getting trained. We have people go through our trainings and they're only getting, maybe 2 hours of training. That's what they tell us personally. Yeah. So that's part of our heart in the trainings that we offer, is to give them that training to use wherever they're already serving. Yeah. So, and that's why the book was written. I'm sure that's why Chris wrote his book too. This heart is to at least begin some education around this issue in a way that pastors can hear it. And coming from a pastor's family, and the desire not to demonize anybody, it's just a lack of information. Yeah. And these men are sons of God who need Christ, and they need God's help. And I think I have 4 sons, and I think, how would I want them treated? And so we speak the truth. I'm sure Chris does this too. We speak it straightforward, but respectfully, and really believe that if you don't do this with a desire to truly care about them, you really don't have a right to speak into their life. Sure. And you won't have any impact in their lives.
We often say,
otherwise you're just a number.
Right. Yeah. We often say, Stacey, that we want to say hard things in safe ways.
Yeah.
And we use Galatians 6 as our rubric for that. Brothers and sisters, if any of you is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore such a one and do it in a manner of gentleness. Now, we don't reduce consequences. That's God's job, because Galatians 6 goes on to say, a man will reap what he sows. God will not be mocked. But we want gentleness and winsomeness to kind of be our demeanor, in large part because we believe that's a great way to address violence, because you don't want to return violence with violence. Absolutely. Or be bully the bully. It doesn't work.
Mhm.
But at the same time, we want to demonstrate the redemptive nature of Christ while holding firm to consequences and being resolute in truth that this is not acceptable. And to the other point, Stacey, I think that you brought up well is the lack of training. That same type of resolute desire has to be present in the church because, to your point, I think some folks will say, well, we've got to refer all this out of the church. But the assumption is that the secular world is more equipped than we are. You're not equipping anybody. This problem is so hidden, so mismanaged, so miscommunicated that the church has as much right and opportunity as anybody to step into this role to speak truth. And we have more resources than even some of our community-based agencies ever dreamed of.
Yeah, and here in our state, male-female co-facilitation is used for intervention program. It's a state standard. We believe it's really the best way. We understand that some programs are too small and they make allowances in our state for those organizations. But I think that the effectiveness of our programs has been proven through, that co-facilitation model of being able to model shared power, to be the feminine voice in the room, to make sure the victim's voice is being heard. And nationally, and Chris, you probably know this, nationally, the studies that have been done on intervention programs and men who complete them, 50% of them will reoffend.
Right.
And we've been running our numbers because part of meeting state standards is showing that we're actually effective in the work we do. We've been running at under 5% since 2015 when I started running our numbers, which is amazing. And we know that God makes a difference and good facilitation is second, and then great materials after that, because you can have great materials and horrible facilitation doesn't work well. So
boy, that's something to hear.
See, I really
the difference
love this
in those
work.
numbers.
I really do. I'm very passionate about doing it, and my husband works with me, so he trained with me, and we've been leading groups for years, and have multiple groups and serve multiple counties.
Well, I'm sorry to nerd out, Juli, but this is like Stacey and I are going to have a great conversation because discipleship makes a difference. And I think that's something that your listeners can really take home with them. Stacey's citing, I believe, Ed Gondorf's research, which showed us that if you have a program with a curriculum and men complete that curriculum and they're accompanied by a community coordinated response or a care team, then they have a greater rate of success versus recidivism. So when you add Stacey's component of discipleship and scriptural sufficiency and biblical confrontation, what we're seeing is what we naturally know, which is discipleship makes a difference when it comes to transformation, because we're not just measuring recidivism, we're looking for transformation from safety, sanity, and then sometimes we even get sanctification. So it's really good to hear the efficacy rising when we include things like the scriptures.
Yeah, and discipleship also for their survivors, that they have their own discipleship journey. I want to go back to something that you said earlier, Stacey. You talked about the lack of education in the church, but you also mentioned that there are biblical topics that keep us from addressing abuse in healthy ways. Maybe three we might mention is, first of all, sort of the turn the other cheek kind of teaching, divorce and the sanctity of marriage, and then also submission. And so this topic overlaps theologically with those three things. And I know that both of you are students of the Word, you teach the Word, you highly value the Word of God. So how do you navigate effectively addressing abuse while recognizing that sometimes misunderstanding the application of those theologies can get in the way?
Yeah, I know our women's recovery program called Her Journey, which is national and international. We served over 40,000 women. Our experience is that the women say, Stacey, I love God, but I hate church because the church hasn't handled it well. And, in the beginning, I had so many women say, you're the first person who said that I could actually leave. There's a verse in Proverbs that says the prudent man or woman sees danger and hides. And God would never sacrifice the person for the sake of the relationship, but people do, and the church does. And I understand God is a God of reconciliation. And that obviously is what God wants, but you can't always have reconciliation. And we teach in our class where we talk about what forgiveness isn't. And I tell this story about our pastor who talked about forgiveness. And the one thing he added was, it's not true forgiveness unless you've reconciled. Well, there's problems with that within an abusive relationship. So I went up to him afterwards and I said, so if you had a friend who just dropped by once in a while, and one day he dropped by and you weren't home and you raped your wife, would you let him back in your home? He's like, absolutely not. I said, so God would probably still require you to work for forgiveness, but that doesn't mean you're going to have ongoing relationship with them.
Right.
So there, that big piece of like that fear of divorce is a big issue. And in my trainings, I also tell, it's kind of a joke, but it's a story of a woman who goes to a pastor and says, Pastor, can God forgive murder? And he thinks for a while, and he thinks of King David, and he goes, yeah, I think God can forgive murder. And she goes, so would it be better to murder my husband than divorce him? Because the faith community has made divorce like the worst sin. And my sister experienced this. She just felt so horrible. She had married a pastor and she never talked about it, because that's what you do as a good Christian woman. And, and that, so she did the one thing that we were raised to never do, just never do this. But God sees, and there's 2 places in the Bible where God gives Israel her certificate of divorce. So he knows there's going to be limitations to this. And there's so much, I mean, not enough time in this show to talk about everything. And I'll just touch on that piece of it. And I'll let Chris maybe touch on one of the other ones that you shared. So
I think a lot of them go hand in hand, guys. And I think our presuppositions will undermine our practical theology if we don't include aspects of personhood. So if I don't personalize and really process I'm done with all P's today. If I don't personalize and process my presuppositions, they'll undermine the way in which I live out my life. And I think an example that you brought up of turn the other cheek, it's really the way we interpret that in the West is built upon a presupposition of power in a lot of ways. Like in Jesus's day, he's teaching people in Matthew chapter 5 how to resist oppression nonviolently. I mean, Gandhi understood this. He wasn't even a Christian. Martin Luther King Jr. understood this. But for the Western church, we sometimes will hear turn the other cheek and we just think be a doormat. But the 3 stories that Jesus tells, turning the other cheek is to demand of the other person to treat you like a human. Like if you're going to hit me like a man would be something I might say. It puts the expectation and the eyes back on the violator. If that person chooses to hit you with a closed fist, being a Roman soldier, that was not legal, where a backhand was. A little bit more easy is the subsequent stories, which is if somebody sues you for your coat, give them your undercoat. Well, that was the 2 pieces of garments that Jewish men had in the day. So it's really the story of leaving the courtroom naked. And in the early Jewish culture, if you saw someone naked, it was shameful. If you were naked, it was more shameful. If you caused someone to be naked, it was most shameful. So again, the responsibility is to turn our eyes back to the sinner, not the sufferer. And then the last one, to walk the extra mile, is to be accosted by a Roman soldier and forced to carry his pack for 1 mile. You were obligated to do that. But after that, you were not. Jesus is like, the first mile is oppression. The second is freedom. And so everyone's eyes again turn to the oppressor. And that's what we're saying. Biblical resistance, Romans 12 says the same thing. As much as it depends upon you, live at peace with everyone, overcome evil with good. 1 Peter, which is often misinterpreted to harm victims, actually could help victims if we saw it from a biblical resistance. I say all that to say we could learn a lot from, say, our Anabaptist brothers and sisters, our brothers and sisters in the African American church that understand biblical resistance a little bit better than we do. It's not about being a doormat. It's about drawing attention to the sin that's being committed against you, right? Rather than drawing attention to your own reaction and response. And I do think, lastly, this comes in large part from a theology of authority that's really ravaged the evangelical church. I'm not against authority, but authority has limits. And in some of our churches, we use delegated or constituted authority, and we say, well, you have to obey authority unless they tell you to sin against God. But every human authority has time, place, and manner restrictions. It's not simply a matter of, did they have you sin directly against God? Well, no, but the controlling, authoritative nature in which they abuse power is a problem. So a husband who demands that his wife change clothes and wear the type of dress that he wants her to wear is really a restriction of agency that we should address and not say, well, he has authority. In the same way, we would be appalled at a police officer who searched our kid's car without permission. That's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Well, why are we so quick to judge that abuse of power, but not others, when the pastor is irresponsible or the husband is coercive and controlling? So we go on and on forever, but presuppositions will
let me ask you, Chris. So the turn the other cheek passages that you just talked about, how would you apply that? What would you say to a woman who has a husband who sometimes gets out of hand and yells at her, and she's like, God just wants me to endure it. And like, I mean, I think even in First Peter, like you said, like it gives the example of Christ enduring suffering, and then it goes right into, in the same way, wives, be submissive to your husbands. So what would you tell her?
And then the prescription in 1 Peter 3 is gentleness and quietness, which I actually think are great responses to abuse, much superior responses to actions and behaviors that are going to draw attention to yourself and have people go, well, it's mutual, or well, she's really
give me an example of like what might.
I would much rather take the passage, and then if I can, because in 1 Peter 2, Jesus was reviled and didn't revile back. It was his love that compelled him to the cross. Earlier in the passage, we're told that slaves who are being beaten by their masters endure it because they did what was right. And that's a great example, because if the slave is doing what's right and he's still being beaten, it's because he didn't do what the master wanted. What the master wanted was wrong. The same's true with husbands who mistreat their spouses. Biblical resistance can be gentle, can be quiet, but doesn't mean it's weak or inactive. Peace is always active. That's what I want your listeners to hear. Peace is not passivity, it's pacific, right? Those are very different. The Pacific Ocean is the peaceful ocean, not because it isn't dangerous or it doesn't have power, right? And that's the difference. We're not asking people to be passive, but to be actively peaceful. So here's what I would suggest. Go ask for help. Get folks around you that will highlight your abuser's sin in such a way that the church sees it. Maintain a team that's going to call him to account and call you into comfort. And when pastors use 1 Peter 3 and they say, well, Jesus trusted God, so you should trust God, I get irate, quite frankly. I'm done. I'm burnt toast on this. Because when she comes to you for help, pastor, she is trusting God. That's why Peter wrote in 1 Peter 5 that you're the shepherd of God's flock. You're called to protect. As Christ trusted himself to the guardian of his soul, God himself, she's trusting you as the guardian of her soul. So don't pat her on the back and say, good luck. Trust God in a dangerous situation. Intervene and find ways to provide safety and sanity, while at the same time confront him and call him to repentance. Of course, there's a lot of strategies for that, but that would be my take. I think 1 Peter is just radically misused to keep victims in dangerous situations, rather than wisely used to see that people who are under oppression have a means to resist. And sometimes that even means relief, which for some reason in the evangelical church, we don't like the idea of relief. We should all suffer well, but you are allowed to avoid suffering. It is not a means of sanctification. It's a means of sanctification.
Yeah.
And we teach, submission is not something that can be demanded.
No.
Submission is something that we give when we feel safe and when we're being led in a right direction. So when someone is demanding submission, that's oppression.
Yeah.
And so we do a whole class with our women and with our men around submission versus oppression, talking about these types of things. So if a woman were to come to me and say she's experiencing these abusive things, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to her. I'm going to validate her experience. I'm not going to try to judge. I tell pastors, don't do that. It's not your position to decide whether or not she's in an abusive relationship. Send her to get some help. Do not confront the abuser. Go and get her to the place where she can get some help, some healing for what she's going through. In our women's recovery group, or her journey group, the women can join at any time. They can come in and they can begin their journey. We just walk alongside them. We don't tell them what to do. We don't tell them to stay, whether to leave, or any of those things. We're just there to walk alongside them. The women, as they begin to gain their sense of value, because they are valuable, God created them that way, then they make different choices. And at some point, they start setting boundaries. And oftentimes, the only boundary that works is separation. And I would suggest that for normal marital conflict, but for these relationships, it's very functional. And so then the women then set a boundary of him going to a program. It doesn't mean he will change, but it gives him opportunity to change.
Yep.
And so we allow her to kind of move that ship forward the way she feels she needs to move it forward. The last thing she needs is another controlling person in her life.
Yeah.
So we want to just walk alongside her and pray for her. And I tell you, we have just watched amazing situations of women just making great change and making really hard decisions and moving forward in their lives and on to help other women who've experienced abuse as well. So I think that the first thing is we have to honor them. You can't begin working with the abuser until she is in a safe place. So some churches have sent out like whole teams of people to say, hey, brother, don't you do that to your wife. If you do, you're going to have to answer to us. And then they leave. And then she's home alone and she has to deal with him who's now very angry at her for sharing the secret. And they've just put her in great danger.
Well,
And so there has to be,
worldview.
you have to make sure that she's in a place of safety before you can do the accountability to the abuser. And, so it's a process and it's a long process and it's a difficult process. Yeah. I'd be lying if I said anything else.
Well, I mean, I think even when I hear that, to know somebody's in an abusive home and to say, I can't do anything other than try to support this woman. Like even there's probably children in danger. There could be lives at stake. And you're saying that it's not right to intervene there. Tell me about that.
You know, if you hop in there and she's not ready, then so maybe the police do a wellness check or DHS, the Department of Human Services does a wellness check. They're all going to stand there and say, everything's fine. She's going to say it's fine because they're going to say it's fine. Because we had a youth do this and someone sent DHS to their door and they all lied. And he said, this young man said, I will never tell anybody again.
Wow.
Because it's unsafe. So you have to, it's really best to work with the person who's experiencing the abuse. Now, if children are being abused, they're in danger, then we feel like we are morally obligated to help her to move this forward. And we encourage her to make that report to Child Protective Services, because if not, they may take the children from her because they feel that she wasn't able to keep her own children safe. So, but if she can make that report, then it helps the whole process move forward. And we also help the women understand that children who witness abuse have the exact same effects as those who are being directly abused, except for children who witness abuse have higher rates of mental health issues. Yep. And so we really want to help her to see that. She might think, well, I don't want to leave till they graduate from high school. Or he's a good dad. He abuses me, but he's a good dad. Well, he's not being a good dad because he is being abusive and it is impacting them. So, we want to help them understand that these children are powerless without their help to begin standing up. But we got to help her to see her value and help her to strengthen her to gain her confidence to actually begin making some of those steps that she needs to take.
Yeah, most church workers, pastors, church leaders are mandated reporters when it comes to child abuse, elder abuse, abuse of a disabled person. It's all about agency. There are a few states that have some interesting written laws about domestic violence, but I tell our folks, if you witness violence at the church house or the parking lot, you should call the police. It's the best means of intervention in the moment. But disclosures of domestic abuse generally could put the victim in more harm's way if you don't build a plan. So I always want folks to have safety plans in place. And then we want to give her options, which is advocacy 101. And it goes back to Stacey's point of we don't need another controlling person. I often tell our folks, she doesn't need a savior. She already has one. His name is Jesus. So us rescuing her is not helping. But we're here to empower, to help her with some choices, give her resources. And then, Stacey mentioned the church, assembling the kind of the witch hunt party and going and threatening the guy. A horrible way to do that. It just reinforces the worldview. It just comes back to, the bully gets his way. Don't bully these guys. Work with the victim, get advice and consent, and then build a plan that's going to strategically lead to her safety and sanity, and then allow him to be confronted and called to repentance effectively. And it goes
Now,
back to the last concept.
Now, most of the time, probably 99% of the time, you're not going to have a woman say, I'm being abused.
No,
It's going to
I don't know that
be,
I've ever had
yeah,
that.
it's going to
The first
be
disclosure.
a woman in a Bible study who is just kind of hinting that there's problems in marriage. It might be a marriage counseling situation where they go to a pastor and something's a little off, but boy, he seems charismatic and he's saying all the right things. Boy, I've heard this story over and over and over again. We don't pick up on it. The counselor doesn't pick up on it. The pastor doesn't pick up on it. The Bible study leaders aren't picking up on it. And from what I understand, a lot of women who are being abused don't even realize it's abuse. Like often it's not until they get out of the situation that they look back and they're like, wow, like I didn't see that. So if they're not using that word, if they're not bringing forth like very overt signals, what do you look for as a friend, as a counselor, as a church leader? What are the red flags?
And Chris I'm sure he has his answer to this too. So if from her, there's a lot of, and this, of course, her abuser is doing this, but she's maybe not allowed to go to a women's Bible study because he's not willing to watch the kids, or to a women's retreat. She'll maybe talk about, maybe has anger issues, when really abuse isn't about anger out of control. It's about someone using their anger to control.
Yep.
So, she doesn't feel free to make decisions. She's fearful, and you can kind of see it on her face. But I actually notice it more with the men. I think some of the signs I see are probably more with the men. So abusers usually are the ones coming forward saying, I'm the victim. And like you said, women who are being abused don't use the word victim. They don't see themselves as a victim. He's never hit me. Even if he said her, she often doesn't use those words. But perpetrators do use the word victim. And he's often within the faith community coming forward saying, I'm really worried for my wife. She has mental health issues. I'm not really abusing her. She's just viewing what I'm doing as abuse because she was abused before. She's cheating on me. These are like some of my top red flags. When I do intakes with guys, they all, all of them say some of these things, or all of them. And once in a while, I'll get somebody who goes, you've heard this before. And I'm like, yeah, a few times. So, and even working with the men in the men's group, I continually am trying to help them understand that being a victim is a very weak place, and do you really want to be there? To realize they're really not the victim, they really do have the power in the relationship. So whether he's controlling how she dresses, how she looks, I've watched women go from being beautiful and wearing makeup to just gradually dressing down, not wearing makeup, not fixing their hair because he's concerned about her cheating on him. So there's all these kinds of behaviors that kind of pick up on it. But, I think that that's a hard one to do because these are people who are sitting in church that look like the perfect family. And they're involved in activities, So, but I can tell you, and Chris knows this, as a pastor, and I encourage pastors, you should preach about this twice a year, specifically, not just mention it in a lesson, on a sermon, but actually preach on domestic abuse twice a year. Because if you make it safe, people will come forward.
They will.
They will come forward, and you should be ready, and you didn't know what resources are in your area and where you can send them. And that's so important. If our churches were preaching about it and making it safe, then it would be being addressed for both the victim and the perpetrator. And because as men stand up to other men saying this isn't okay, we're going to see great change.
Yeah.
And not that women don't use abuse. We get that. We understand that too.
And when you preach on it, you're helping people make connections of, wow, that's happening at my home. And you're giving language to start describing that. I know when we've done podcast episodes on this before, I've had even people I know like email me, like I've never recognized the toxic dynamics in my own home until I heard that.
Yeah. We go through the 8 forms of abuse. And as soon as we do that, it's like, whoa, it's like they never thought of these other things as abusive. I just did at a conference, I spoke on it, and it was men and women, and these are leaders in missions. And one man stayed afterwards and I didn't know if he wanted to talk to me or what. He was on his phone. He goes, "Sorry, I argued with my wife and I'm just texting her and telling her how abusive and manipulative I was. This was very convicting."
Wow.
Because we've all done abusive things, said things that were abusive in our life. But an abuser is somebody who's using a pattern of behaviors.
Sure.
And I guess that's really what we're looking for, is someone who's using a pattern of behaviors, has really strong male privileged beliefs about what their rights are as a man and as a husband in their home. And those things are pretty easy to pick up on, I think, in just general conversations, I think, from men. So if we see something, like even something that isn't really as overt, like maybe he puts her down sarcastically in front of a group of people, you can privately pull her aside and say, "Did you know that's abusive?"
Mm-hmm.
And she may not be happy with hearing that, but it may put her on the journey to discovery.
Yeah.
We're generally looking for the constellation, not the single stars. And I think that's a big distinction between people in the work and outside the work. So a lot of my pastor friends will think of incidents of abuse, which, criminally, if you're trying to convict someone as a prosecutor, you want a significant incident. But in our world, you're looking for patterns of behavior. So when you take these things that Stacey said, the lack of agency, control, the fear, the threats, the intimidation, the minimization, denial, and blame, when a perpetrator's like, "Oh yeah, that's not that big a deal," or "It's not my fault." That's when you start to build out the constellation. It's like, oh, well, there's the Big Dipper, right? It wasn't just this bright light in the sky. It's a series of lights that point to a problem. And my friend Darby Strickland puts it this way with the role reversal. She says, looking at an abuse case is like looking at your reflection in a spoon. Everything's upside down and distorted. And I would bring that up again. Sometimes we'll use the word Darvo, or some other example to say that offenders like to reverse roles. They like to deny, attack, and then reverse offender and perpetrator. And so abusers will often blame others. That's a huge one for me. Or substances, or my mom didn't hold me enough, or too much. Victims are usually often will blame themselves and be over responsible, which makes marriage counseling, to that one point, Juli, you made, really impotent. When we start throwing marriage-focused solutions at a non-marriage problem, we end up re-victimizing in many ways and making it far more difficult to see any type of reconciliation or reunification, because this isn't a marriage problem. It's the problem of one person's heart desiring power and control. It's a James 4. What causes fights and quarrels among you? It's your desires that work within you. You want something, you can't get it. So you kill and you have it. That's what needs to be uprooted, is this heart of pride and the mind of Christ offered as an alternative.
Yeah.
99% of our women have tried couples counseling.
Sure.
And as many as 15 counselors.
Wow.
And
I believe it.
work because it's like oil and water. They don't mix. They're not the same issue, and they need to be dealt with completely differently. I have so many horror stories where the counselor, just really lean towards the abuser and then accuse the victim of being controlling when she tried to bring it back to what they were supposed to be talking about. So it's just very, very hard. And these women that we work with so want to be affirmed, be seen for their experience that they have. And yet most people don't understand it. I even had a woman in my group last night who was like talking with her family, and they were saying all the normal Christian things that are said to women. And she was so heartbroken over how they didn't see her and didn't understand the issue.
Yeah.
And so, we encourage them that God does understand, and stay at the feet of Jesus and he will defend you. And that you don't need to go around trying to convince everybody of your abuse. You just need to seek the help that you need for yourself.
And when you think about the dynamics, let's say a couple goes to marriage counseling, the woman has been abused in some way. And so she's in a fear state. She's confused. The man has been in control. And so how are they going to present? He's going to present at face value a lot healthier than she is.
Sure.
Yeah.
And if the counselor doesn't know what to look for, she becomes the problem. So,
and Chris, you probably know this too. It's like most men who are regular church attending men will go to their leaders, their pastors, the leaders in the church, to present their case so that she is not believed. They discredit her, so she is not believed. So when she comes forward, he's been traumatizing her. She's in a place of trauma. She's blinking a lot. She's not putting her sentences together well. And so the pastor, as much as he doesn't want this other man's statements to affect his decision, he begins to wonder, well, maybe she does have mental health issues, but really it's just trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trauma will easily present in that scenario as kind of a jumbled ball of yarn, right? Where my thoughts are going to go from point to point, and it will even present sometimes as exaggerations or half truths or not full confessions. And so victims are oftentimes perceived as liars, as not getting their story straight, whereas abusive individuals, being in control, can operate on a line and they seem much more logical and rational. This is why questions, listening, and time are three of our greatest tools in addressing the problem. And I tell folks, especially pastors in marriage counseling, when there's a suspicion of abuse, I encourage them to break away for separate counseling and without exposing the problem. That gives the victim a safe place, hopefully, to dialogue, and a place for eventually for the perpetrator to be addressed when advice, consent, and all the other kind of dominoes have been knocked down. You also see pretty quickly who's willing to comply and who's not. And abusive individuals who seek control will often rear their head pretty quickly if you try to separate counseling and care.
Yeah. It makes me wonder if we should always do separate
I'm
sessions.
a big believer in early separate intake.
No, I think it makes sense.
The 3-session intake is a great thing.
Right. Because there's a lot of things when you go to marriage counseling that you don't feel comfortable saying in front of your spouse, but they are often the real issues underneath it.
And we have a questionnaire that they can take them through.
Okay.
And we even have one on our website that, how healthy is your relationship? And it's non-gendered, so that anybody could take it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Chris, what questions you ask, and Stacey, maybe it's some of those that are on that questionnaire. But even if I'm just a friend or a Bible study leader, and I'm not sure what's going on, somebody looks like they could be in that situation, what do I ask?
There's all kinds of. I think just being a good spiritual friend would allow you just to do some check-in questions. And when it comes to a victim, it's entirely up to the victim whether or not they're ready or feel like they can trust you to share the information. So I want you to know that just being present and putting yourself in that situation of, is everything okay? Is there anything I can help you with? You've actually done good work because you presented yourself as faithful, as present, and you're available when the time comes for disclosure. When it comes to abusive individuals, those questions are usually down the line after you have, again, advice and consent. And I tend to be, this is just trick of the trade, and this is not something you do initially. This is weeks or months down the road. I prefer what-based questions to why-based questions. If I ask an abuser why he did something, I get a story. If I ask what, I get a motivation, and motivation's a lot easier to wrestle with. What did you want when you punched that hole in the wall? What did you hope that she would do when you called her that horrible name? Is a lot better than why did you punch a hole in the wall? And it really reduces the minimization and the excuses. So those are things that you really, before you engage in anything like that, listener, you really need to get some training, whether it's through Stacey's ministry or through PeaceWorks, where you're really going through some lengthy training on how to confront and address and work with perpetrators, whether it's through the abuse groups or BIPs or Men of Peace, which is what we offer at PeaceWorks.
I think that too, that, if you're friends with somebody and they seem fearful, ask them, are you afraid of your husband? Does he get angry? Does his anger surprise you? Are you surprised when he does get angry? Do you feel like you ask a question and you end up someplace you never expected to go? Those are really safe questions that aren't into, has he ever pushed you or shoved you or hit you or slapped? I mean, the women don't want to talk about that kind of stuff, right? So, in fact, a lot of our trainings, I have to rename to healthy relationships versus toxic relationships kind of thing, because the reality is that the women coming to those kinds of things are really usually experiencing abuse, and that's why they're coming to those things. And you can see it on their face when they come in, how depressed. I mean, the vast majority of 99.9% of our women are depressed, and I would probably say 90% of our men are. So, there's a lot of depression going on. And over the years, since I've been doing this for so long, and I'm sure Chris has too, we see a lot more mental health than we ever had with both our men and our women. The depression, the anxiety, all those things are just really over the top right now.
Mm-hmm. And the way you all are talking about it, I think this is really important. Abuse is a continuum. It's not either you're abusive or you're not. Like you even said, all of us have done abusive things in our past or in our relationships. And I think that's important because when we start making it a category of you are or you're not, people get confused about which category they're in, or they feel like, man, if I admitted to that, like there's all kinds of shame attached to that. But when it's more like, how toxic is your relationship? Where are there some things that God wants to reveal and heal? Like, I think almost every intimate relationship would be like, yeah, there's some unhealthy things. And there are patterns that I've picked up, whether it's a pattern of victimization or a pattern of abuse and control, that it's like, no, God wants to heal that. He doesn't want us to stay in that. So that seems like a healthier introduction to this.
Yeah. Abuse is sin. I mean, and it doesn't matter whether you're male or female. Whether you're a primary aggressor or a secondary aggressor, which we work with both. And so we understand that continuum of where people stand on it. The really key, I think, point is that truly someone who has an abusive personality who's using a pattern of parent control, where you and I may have said something we shouldn't have said, and that's still sin, and we need to address it, but it's not a pattern. I'm not afraid of my husband. We can have conversations and work through them and discuss where we failed. And it's about neutrality, where domestic abuse is always about winning and controlling the other person or the situation that they're in.
Yeah, boy, that's a good distinction. So where would you send people? Let's talk first about the individual who's all kinds of bells are going off in their head and they're like, man, I need help. Where would that individual go?
So there's both, Chris and I both, have the agencies that we have. Abuse Recovery Ministry and Services, or ARMS, is the organization that we run. And our women's program is free, and they can join it at any time.
Is it virtual? They can join it from anywhere?
We have both virtual and in person. We're looking for more leaders. It's volunteer driven. So we have over 100 leaders and who go through extensive training and do ongoing training that's required to become a leader. And so it's they don't have to do anything special. They don't have to start at group one. They call, they don't have to give us their name. It's very trauma informed. They can just go to that group, and they don't even have to give us the real name there. They don't have to talk at the group if they don't want to. So it makes it very safe. We have counselors who love sending people to us because they know the women, they can just come and just sit and hear God's heart around this issue. So that's one. Of course, there's so many other options, along with Chris's organization as well that he's a part of. But I would say even if they don't want to do that, whatever is out there, look for what's out there. Yeah. And there aren't as many, very, very few nationally, faith-based intervention programs. Right. But it is a boundary that these women can set for these men going through a program. Yeah. There's even fewer faith-based women's intervention programs for women who have been victims but have also used abusive behaviors. But reach out. I mean, I know that we're here for you. I mean, we get calls from the National Domestic Hotline. I mean, they're a great place to call. They know all the resources pretty much across the nation. So they're a great resource. The family justice centers that are national, we send a lot of our women there because we only do what we do, but we send them there for other services, legal services, whatever else they need. They can get at these family justice centers, and you can look those up online and find them as well. So our site is abuserecovery.org, and they can just go to it or just call us at our number on our website as well.
Great. Well, we will link to all that in our show notes. And would you add anything, Chris?
Yeah, I think local agencies are tremendous helps. If you have doubts, most police departments have a liaison or somebody who can give you contact information. You don't have to file a criminal complaint. or report, you can simply ask. And they usually have someone who can connect you to a community-based agency. Their services are generally all free as well, not just shelter services, but often support groups and legal aid and court navigation and things that are tremendously helpful. Intervention groups, as Stacey said, are few and far between. I have no problem with sending people to a local batterer intervention program. If you are a church member or a church leader that's walking with a man, see if you can go with them. Like, see if the program will let you quietly sit and observe and take notes. I see that as a tremendous benefit as you guys are both learning and processing together. And then chrismoles.org is our website, and you can learn more about the things that we do, the PeaceWorks podcast that I lead, as well as PeaceWorks Live, which is our annual training event. But Men of Peace is our facilitated or our intervention option, and we're actually adding facilitation in 2025, hopefully, with a few other places around the country. So trying to bulk up faith-based intervention from a biblical perspective.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for what you do. So needed in our faith communities.
Thank you.